in development and humanitarian aid, a lot of the feedback or a lot of the data collected from migrants is very quantitative. Did you get this? Did you get that? How many things were delivered? But actually, if you sit and understand somebody's whole experience and you actually engage, it's not only empowering for the migrants themselves to be able to tell their full story, but it also provides a different perspective on the services that you're able to offer and why in different contexts.
Welcome back, everybody. Richard Baker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with a spectrum of professionals in the sustainability space, working to, kind of fix the challenge that we face outside of our window. For me, it's all about inspiring the next generation of ambassadors who will be, kind of taking the next role of leadership, trying to find their next pivot in life. In this episode, I'm extremely excited to be joined by Sanushka Mudaliar, who is the director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Global Migration Lab, a research and policy initiative that works with the Red Cross and Red Crescent organizations to gather and analyze data for migration operations. And where I've been asking her to come in is to talk about the work that she's been doing, the challenges around migration, and the progress that we're hopefully going to be making through regulation, data, just understanding where people are going, why they're going there, and how to provide better services, better support once they're there. With that, thank you, Sanushka, for joining us. It's really great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so as a starting point, who are you and what is the work that you're doing?
As a starting point, my work focuses on people moving across international borders because the issues and complexity of the situation that people face outside their country of citizenship is different to people who are internally displaced. Not always dramatically different, but it does create being a non-citizen in a country, unfortunately, creates complexities around your treatment, your ability to be there, your right to be there, and the ways in which your options once you're there. So my work is about people moving across international borders. And for the most part, we tend to think about international migration as people who've moved across a border for more than 12 months. So we're not talking about tourism or some of the other things that have been changing over time.
I guess as a starting point then, what is the size, scale, scope of the global migration challenge today?
I think the headline for me is that the movement of people across borders is being portrayed as this massive global problem, as a political issue, as people coming in an undocumented or unauthorized way, when really, if we take a step back and look at the figures, as a percentage of global population, the number of people moving across international borders semi-permanently has only increased by 1.3% since 1970. And within that, contrary to the images that we often see in the media and the way that politicians talk about migration, the vast majority of these people are moving in what is called regular pathways. So that means they applied, they got a visa, or they satisfied other entry requirements, and then they went to another country. And by far and away, the biggest number of people who are doing that are people moving for work. Then within that, you have a relatively very small group of people who are forced migrants moving across borders to seek safety from conflict, violence, persecution, disasters, and also people who are moving because of poverty and inequality. And I guess for me, the other point that needs to be underlined is that this isn't about people waking up one day in their nice homes thinking, gee, I'd like a better life like those people over there. This is about a complete lack of options or hope for the future.
That subgroup of kind of the climate or the forced migrants, these are the ones that they're without hope. They're the ones that tend to fall within your system or within the other agencies. What's happening there? Is that a growing group exponentially? Is it growing like 1.3%? Is that manageable? Like what's going on there? And then what do you see going forward?
The issue isn't so much that entire countries are going to become unlivable, it's that people will be moving within countries. And when you see people being forcibly displaced internally, you have immediate issues around resource scarcity. You have the issues that come with large-scale humanitarian crisis movements. So you have needs for food, water, shelter, and the knowledge of where people are moving and how they're going to move needs to be combined with preparatory action. So from a humanitarian perspective, there's a lot of work taking place. It's described as participatory action or preparedness, which is to try and gear up communities. There's also a lot of work happening at an international level around what kinds of frameworks and systems are needed in order to respond to that movement of people. Though I'd say from a cross-border perspective, what this is going to do, rather than directly saying climate change is going to lead to this movement of people, it's going to exacerbate existing issues around poverty and inequality and access to services.
What are the most significant gaps in the global response then that you think need greater attention? Like, are there certain structures? Are there certain governance? Is it money? Like, what are the most significant gaps that you see in addressing this potential future challenge?
So what we don't have is a functioning system whereby countries, regardless of where they are in the world, are working together to ensure that when people move, they have the things that they need. In one of our research projects where we talked to 16,000 migrants across 15 countries, we found a figure that was basically 25% of the people we spoke to said that they would avoid a humanitarian assistance point where they might receive safety, shelter, food, medical assistance for fear of detention or deportation. That is to say, the politicization of humanitarian aid is such that people are concerned that if they go and receive life-saving assistance, that this might embed them into systems and processes which may impede their journey. Is that if people can't access life-saving assistance as they move, regardless of why they're moving or to where, then we see this scale of human suffering that's associated with migration. So it's the absence of safe pathways that results in the consequences that we're seeing around us and the scale of humanitarian assistance needs. And a lot of the examples and the ideas that are being presented as solutions are ones that are going to take a very long time to implement. So there's a lot of work going on at a global level around reintegration services for migrants, the creation of decent work at home, looking at improving systems of development, infrastructure investment, those things. But the reality is that's not a short-term solution. And in the context of the global inequality we currently have, people are still going to continue to move. So knowing that people will move or are likely to move in response to the drivers of forced migration, we need to actually be realistic about how we address that. And I should say, there are some really great examples from recent times. When the war in Ukraine happened, millions of Ukrainians moved across borders without the camps that we see on other borders, without mass starvation or detention. When those systems are not in place is where the issue is. And so to me, that's the crux of the problem.
So, shifting a little bit closer to home, the Global Migration Lab. What is the work that you're doing there? What's the vision and mission for the lab itself?
So about 3 years ago, in recognition of the increasing operational footprint of the Red Cross working on migration, and there was a recognition that we're increasingly doing this operational work, but we were not, as a network, putting that together into the kinds of cross-country comparative analyses that we could be. So there's a lot of great research going on in the Red Cross, but we were set up to try and support Red Cross and Red Crescent organisations to think through what data are they gathering and how might it be used for two purposes. One is to improve our operations so that we're serving migrants and communities better. And secondly, so that we have an evidence base that can be used to support our work with governments and in the international system to ensure better humanitarian outcomes and protection and assistance for people is available. And the main thing we do is generative research projects. So the projects are about key topics in the migration landscape that are relevant not only to us as humanitarian actors, but to the international system. So we looked at things like COVID and migrants' access to essential services in the context of the pandemic in different countries. We've looked at our big project that I mentioned earlier is migrants' trust in humanitarian assistance. So what kind of assistance are migrants receiving along their routes? What do they say about it? What is their perspective on what they're receiving and what they're not receiving? So going back to the earlier point that 25% of the migrants in that research project identified that they may not access humanitarian assistance for fear of detention and deportation. That kind of thing provides us with the information to go and talk to governments about the implications of politicization of humanitarian aid.
Besides talking to the governments, like, do you somehow use that as a way to improve the delivery of internal programs that then face that 25%? Like, is this both say a strategic external type of research as well as an operational research?
No, absolutely. Our two goals are both to improve the operations that we are providing as a network of Red Cross and Red Crescent organisations, and then also to think about what is the evidence base. So the way we design our projects is also about the process as much as the product. On the product side, there is a pervasive lack of qualitative data representing the lived experience of migrants at the front lines. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, including the fact that these are mobile populations and populations who may be unwilling to share information at length. However, this is also where the Red Cross's historic role as a neutral and impartial actor and the spread of our operations into local communities all over the world provides us with a real opportunity. So we can contribute qualitative research that it's difficult to do at scale, but we also use that research process as an opportunity to support local branches of the Red Cross, national societies of the Red Cross, to increase their understanding of research methods that might help them not only in our project, but also in other work that they do. And so our goal, we're still a work in progress, is to really engender participatory action research methods into the work that organisations are doing, because in development and humanitarian aid, a lot of the feedback or a lot of the data collected from migrants is very quantitative. Did you get this? Did you get that? How many things were delivered? But actually, and I learned this throughout multiple organizations and countries in my career, if you sit and understand somebody's whole experience, how did they end up where they were? Why are they behaving in a particular way? And you actually engage, it's not only empowering for the migrants themselves to be able to tell their full story and know that it's being listened to and acted on, but it also provides a different perspective on the services that you're able to offer and why in different contexts.
I mean, even if I'm talking to early career individuals, like being out in the field and understanding what's actually happening is kind of the core to everything. And I'm not saying that the Red Cross or other organizations get away from that over time, but you can see where that falls in, where people get really complacent. They think they know what's going on. They're creating policies and programs, but bringing that back down to the field, like really showing that research could be quite powerful, I think, to everybody involved. And I guess
time consuming. It's hard to do, it's time consuming, it's difficult when you're operating at scale, but it's still possible.
But given you're a small team, how do you look at the research and the questions that you want to ask and answer? Do you try and go for the small iterations that palatable internally can have a nice impact, practically, or are you trying to identify the gaps that are, like the ahas that we as professionals, we've just been kind of muddling through our work and haven't thought deeply enough? And it's like, did you know? And that kind of rewires people. Like, what's the balance you try and strike through that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. I guess for us, when we think about what topics we're going to choose, we go through a process of talking to a lot of stakeholders in the Red Cross to understand that we're on the right track. But we're also aware that we're not actually able, with our kind of blunt instrument of large data collection, necessarily to be able to get to the 5%. So we talk to our stakeholders and then we look at the topics that we've got and also do a pretty serious and thorough process of literature review to know that at least we'll be contributing to knowledge on this side. But then, as I mentioned before, we also try and build projects that we know, even if the data that comes out of it is only useful in these ways, actually there's been a whole lot of other benefits of participating in the project. One example I can give you of a project we're doing right now is we are researching the factors that affect the likelihood of women and children going missing, becoming separated from their groups, or dying along specific migration routes. So we know, for example, when people are about to embark on a boat journey, often in the chaos of a beach, family groups will get split up because there's only X number of places on this beach. We know some of that information, but we're trying to get deeper into the things that we can't know, like the people who are missing. Is there something along particular journeys that makes it more likely that those people will go missing, that we can then define a series of criteria beyond what we already know to try and prevent that from happening? So we're finding out some interesting things through that project. And again, this is through long form qualitative interviews where we ask people open-ended questions. Like, for example, one of the things we found is that people on boat journeys suffer a higher rate of burns from fuel and proximity to the engine. That has meant on subsequent journeys, people with severe burns aren't able to keep up with groups. And that is related to, on a particular route, the number of people who are becoming separated. I mean, these are things that some practitioners will be able to tell you, but to be able to extract that at a global scale and be able to say, oh, how does this compare to what's happening on that route, a different sea route? That's kind of what we're trying to achieve. But yeah, I would say that because of the lack of information about specifically how migrants are moving and what their experiences are, we try and aim for the big gaps, recognizing that it's an iterative process, and what we get from interviews that are carried out may or may not fill that gap, but we try and make sure that there's enough steps along the way that it's going to be useful.
All right, we're going to make a slight pivot here, as we often do. Can you share a bit about your own journey into the field of migration and kind of what inspired you to not just specialize in this area, but to build a career around it? I think oftentimes it might be a personal catalyst, or it might be a professional interest, or it might just be a connection to the individual. What was it for you, and why have you made this your career?
It's a bit hard to say how you land where you do, right, Rich? I mean, all of us create a nice narrative on our CVs, but actually that fails to represent some of the twists and turns along the journey. I would say I always wanted to do something about social justice, I think because I was born in Australia soon after my parents left South Africa and spent parts of my childhood running around in ANC t-shirts and thinking about the struggle to end apartheid in South Africa with a child's sort of lens on it. So, standing outside an embassy or with a group of protesters, and hearing my parents' stories and knowing that we were so far away from our own community and family and what they grew up with. So I guess that was part of it. Although actually when I was at university, my interest was more in international development and the more nuts and bolts of poverty alleviation processes. And I think I left university with a much more traditional view of what was needed to address the global challenge of poverty. I was very fortunate though I went on an Australian volunteers program where I was at Oxfam Australia for part of my time, learn about what does it look like at a village level to support a community, to build infrastructure, create water and sanitation, but also to work with a local women's NGO that was supported by Oxfam called Women's Agenda for Change, that was more about movement building, community building, and thinking about the fact that it's not just about the function. It's not about get X water to Y place. It's also about the politics. It's about the systems that resulted in the situation we're trying to address. And so I think that broader systems change really affected how I think about things. So, but in terms of how I ended up where I am, long story short, moved a bunch of countries, partly because of my partner, now husband, partly because we were interested in learning different languages. And in each place managed to find work that was about thinking about movement building, engaging in research with communities, and then suddenly realized that increasingly what was at the edge of the issues that I was working on for communities was the question of migration. So whether it was garment factory workers moving internally from provinces in Cambodia to the outskirts of Phnom Penh to work in the factories and then having to deal with exploitative conditions, or whether it was farmers needing to move within China, for example, and the impact of the Hukou system a lot of it came down to either internal or cross-border migration. And that's how I ended up specializing on low-wage temporary labor migration in particular. So foreign domestic workers in countries like Singapore, the systems and laws and processes around that. And I suppose that's how I end up broadly working at migration.
What's been the role of, say, field research along this journey? Because I feel like oftentimes it's very easy as professionals that we kind of, find ourselves in our office and creating policies and practices and ideas how that can be implemented, but without significant grounding. But you've spent a lot of time out in the field. I'm curious, like, in your view, as part of your professional development, professional abilities, what's been the role of field research, talking with people, seeing all the different contexts and the realities on the ground?
I think it's absolutely fundamental. I think it has radically shaped the way I approach everything I do. It's not to say there's not a role for policy thinking, research, and sitting in an office, but I just think it's fundamental in shaping how I think about how I do my work, that I don't assume that I know better. And I know that if you ask the right questions, or even if you don't ask the right questions, if you just go and sit and listen, that the assumptions that you're making about a circumstance might radically change. And so I guess I try and approach all the work that I'm doing from the perspective that it's possible to go and ask people, even at scale, and to get an answer that you can then turn into something that could go all the way up to the global level. I can give you an example of this, actually. The Red Cross recently developed its first ever joint across all of the organization's migration strategy. We have a lot of strategies and policies. And when this one was being discussed a couple of years ago, usually we'd hire a consultant, that person would speak to key stakeholders and then write something. My team proposed that instead of that, what we should do is go and ask questions at scale to people across the International Red Cross and Red Crescent by holding, practically that meant holding webinars in multiple languages. At times weren't so convenient for the Australian time zone, but that's okay because it meant people could come in and say what they thought. And so we ran a process that asked big questions, thought about what people said, then asked more refined questions. And we now have a document that was passed through the Red Cross governance mechanisms just in October. Yeah, I think the world would look like a very different place if policymakers and strategists and thinkers, instead of throwing ideas out, are actually saying, okay, well, I've got this idea. What do people who are at the coalface actually think about it?
And kind of speaking of time and effort, I mean, you specifically, you kind of wrapped your professional experience around spending a lot of time and effort in that space. So what have you learned? Like, is that intentional that you put yourselves into a position where you're out in the field a lot? Do you try and make sure that with every job or with everything that you're working on, that there's that element of real interaction with the people you're trying to bring benefit? Or do you find over time, like, less and less so that way you can be a little bit more strategic in your value?
So I guess it's a hard thing to answer beyond saying that I've deliberately looked for roles that are about finding out new things and that have a bit of space to design how you do that. The other thing I'd say, sorry, this is one of my bugbears, I try not to use the term the field. I know it's very common, just because the field is where people live, it's their lives. It's not the field, it's not the ground, it's actually that could be you or me if we were born in different places. So I know it's very common, but I don't really think about it as going and getting field experience. I think about it as going and being in a different world or life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reason why I would actually push back a little is like, for a lot of people, that is totally different than their life. They don't realize like that there's a whole different reality for a lot of people. And so you have to go out to their place. And that could be, what I would just call generally the field, because it's like they're in their office, they're behind PowerPoint, they're behind little webcams like this. And I can sense that sometimes there's a disconnect between the reality and then what they're seeing. And so getting out of one's comfort zone sometimes, or realizing that you have to go talk to people in their lived experience, like that's a field that's foreign to you. And I'm not saying that's true of everybody at all times. I actually find that sometimes early in the career, they spent a lot of time, really on the ground with individuals, with systems, with stakeholders, build, and then they're really close to that. But then over time, they become part of the group that's, they're in offices 98% of the time, and they're flying around to events, and they're overseeing the research and the researchers, but they're kind of their emotional, direct intellectual ties to the individuals, to the topics. There's a gap that exists, and I guess that's kind of how I look at it. Like, like it's a function of work and experience, and over time, just getting further and further away from the realities on the ground, which I think, as you've shown, like they're moving quite quickly, like and it's very contextual based. There's a lot of differences and nuances that I feel that can be missed when you spend too much time in your office, in your professional group, and not enough time with those who you say you're there to benefit.
I guess the challenge is also that the way the world works is that everything filters, and decisions are often being made by those people at a high level. And this is where I think the push to ensure diversity and career pathways for people from non-standard backgrounds, from countries that aren't the usual suspects, is so important, because that is how you get that different perspective at senior levels. And it's not really enough for it just to be the president or the figurehead of an organization who has that background. It really needs to be the functionaries. For me, it's also about how do we make sure that, in my very small team, who are we hiring? Are we making sure that we're challenging our assumptions about who can do what job? It's one of the reasons that in building, I keep saying to people, I don't want to build an empire here, but when we were able to expand, we thought about hiring staff in Kenya, hosted by Kenya Red Cross Society, not more people in Australia, not more people like me and the people I work.
It's a great approach to it, because it makes sure that you're closer to realities given the global scope. Like if you had everyone that looked a certain way in a certain time zone from a certain background, you're gonna miss something.
Sorry, one more thing on that, which is that I also recognize that because we are this scrappy startup within a massive institution, we have a luxury that some of my colleagues who are in more institutional roles don't have, which is that we're able to actually go to other country offices of the Red Cross and say, what do you need as part of designing this project? Which is not really the way the systems of incentives or processes or even functions work in most of the most institutions.
What is it like to be a small, scrappy startup in a monster organization or a large organization? Because oftentimes you can kind of feel lost or set aside, but how do you navigate that? Because I think there are some people that we're talking with that they want to be the internal entrepreneur, and they want to change the systems from within or improve them or bring light to certain things. Like, what's the opportunity you see, or what are the challenges you face as being kind of like a small, scrappy startup inside of a large organization?
The way I like to describe it is that 3 years in, it's been a journey. There've been some very good parts of that in terms of being able to find the pockets of innovation and the people to do certain work, but it has been 3 years of trying to work out how the systems work and who the people are so that we can see where we can best add value. And sometimes it's come with a lot of heartache and missed opportunities, and like running in a direction that we think we can do a thing and then realizing that actually that's just not going to be possible. But I would say that 3 years in, I now feel like I have a good read on those things. And I think our next 3 years, as we're writing our new strategic plan, we've identified those cracks, and we've also identified where in the system things are possible and things aren't possible, and why. And that's also talked a lot today about how we face more internally to the Red Cross. We think that's where our most effective change is going to be.
What have been some of the lessons over the last 3 years then? Is it about having coffees with people on a regular basis, just getting to know them as individuals and asking, how can I help you? Or have there been like specific things that you've learned over time to kind of just pay attention to? Because I feel like a lot of sustainability professionals probably not all that different. They come in from outside the organization, and to sometimes some very complex established inert organizations and relationships. How do you if you look back over the last 3 years, what are some of the things that you took away? Like, this is a if I do this, this will be helpful to getting a better understanding, to getting more traction internally. Because I feel like that what you mentioned was like that's one of the key barriers and key piece of work you have to do. What are some lessons that you've learned along the way?
So I guess the two things I'd say is power of relationships, and also taking the time to demonstrate within the system that you're in what it is you're capable of doing. I guess it's also, for me, it's been a process of learning about the differences between what's happening at headquarters, what's happening at the regional office, what's happening at the national level, what's happening at the branch level, and being able to kind of break that down. But also, and I suppose the last thing is also about power analyses. Like, I use that a lot working for activist organizations in campaigning, breaking down who, what, when, and where. And I think as a lab, we've realized not only do we need to do that for the external context, but we also need to think how we connect internally.
How do you identify the right people then? Is it very much like we have this project coming up, here's who we need to talk to? Or do you find that professionally you're just reaching out to different individuals or different parts of the organization to learn about them, say before there's a need? So that way you have some relationships in advance. Like, because I can imagine you could spend all day, like your whole time meeting with people because it's such a large organization. So how do you kind of find balance there? Or is it just like how do you make sure it's not so reactive and so transactional? Like, hey, Bob, I have this project now. I need your help. Like, do you see relationships in advance? Do you like? Are you enjoying this time of being in an organization that is so vast and working on so many things, and therefore you just can reach out like, hey, I'm just a professional in this space with you. Same organization. I love learning about your work because it's super. Like, how do you even start that process?
Yeah, I think it's partly about reaching out to people, and that's one of the amazing things about the Red Cross, is that it's so mission driven that people are by and large incredibly generous to meet. And the more, I guess, I've learned how to ask key questions about what people can and can't do in a way that's not calling people out, but that I didn't know when I started. Like, I didn't really understand in a non-theoretical way how these organizations actually operate. And it's actually something that in some ways is keeping me here, because I feel like I have all this hard-won knowledge about how to work within this system now. And um, I would feel disappointed at not taking the opportunity to use it. Having said that, I also do miss the freedom of just being able to run with things, to get a grant and have not to have to talk to multiple different parts of the organization about how it will be dispersed into whom and in what order. I find the internal systems, I mean, obviously necessary in a large institution where it's not small enough that you can keep an eye on things, but it does make me think a bit about footloose and fancy free days of just making things happen.
So speaking of footloose and fancy free, there are a lot of people are going to be watching this and wondering how they can get involved and develop a career in the space that you're in. What are a few pieces of advice you give them? They could be young professionals, they could be fresh grads coming out. They want to get into, let's call it, it could be in migration, it could be the wider aid organizations. What are some tips, tricks, hacks that you would give them to get a little bit further along in their career?
It's about being there to know what the opportunities are. Often they're not advertised. So if you're, for example, doing a university project and you can connect with an NGO and make it clear what you can bring to them rather than what you are asking from them, it's a good way into the door, and then you can get to know people. A surprising number of professionals are willing to have coffee and just talk about what they're doing. And one of those coffees that I went to when I was at university, the guy I was talking to who ran an international development consultancy said, you've got to have a speciality. International development is not a profession. Are you water sanitation? Are you health? Are you? And that's how I started thinking, okay, what do I specialize in? So I would say that, and also just being open to moving in different ways. So because I moved partly because of my husband and partly because of me, I landed up twice in countries where I was like, okay, what am I going to do here? I've left behind the things that I wanted to do. But what I learnt was that it may not look like the thing you really want to do is right in front of you, but if you're open to what comes along, there are ways to bring your own ideas and shape it into something that is what you want to do.